People have been arguing about the final 10 minutes of The Last of Us for 12 years. As a piece of narrative fiction, The Last of Us Part 1 goes down very smoothly. The journey might feel a little familiar, but it's always compelling thanks to the deftness of the writing, the rich texture of the world, and the authenticity of the performances. It's a perfectly effective redemption story that is thoroughly straightforward on an emotional and subtextual level. You root for Joel and Ellie without reservation as they claw their way across the continental US. Joel's hardened exterior chipping away bit by bit as they travel together. It's all very conventionally satisfying, right up until the final 10 minutes.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
Please. I swear. You just come after her.
This is what people still argue about over a decade later.
Okay.
All that emotional directness and thematic simplicity is upended, and the game forces you to question the very nature of the journey you just went on. Did Joel kill the Fireflies and save Ellie because he regained his lost humanity? Or are his actions proof that he's still that hardened man who only cares for those closest to him?
Who do you think you're doing? Keep driving. I got a kid, Joel. So do we.
We have room.
Keep driving, Tommy.
Is Joel actually doing this for Ellie, or is he doing this because he can't live without her?
It's what she'd want. And you know it.
Does Joel lie straight to Ellie's face about it to protect her or to protect himself? The game simply cuts to black and leaves us to answer all of these questions for ourselves. This is what made The Last of Us fully click for me when I first played it. Up to this point, I liked the game well enough, but the ending is what convinced me I had just experienced something special. I was so impressed by how the entire story was thrown into such fraught thematic territory at the very last minute, without it feeling forced or unearned. And I immediately wanted to replay it and pay closer attention to Joel's dynamic with Ellie, like the game had retroactively become a sort of excavation of Joel's psychology. It's this ending, this little 10-minute section of a 10 to 12 hour experience that is still generating countless debates over a decade later. So when a sequel was announced in 2016, I remember feeling apprehensive. How do you follow up such a pitch-perfect conclusion without cheapening it somehow? I knew that the sequel would be well made, but if it didn't do real justice to the power and thorniness of those final 10 minutes of part 1, I didn't even want it. And then Naughty Dog took the feeling of those final 10 minutes and stretched it across a 25-hour-long video game. It's been 5 whole years since the release of Part 2, and with a big-budget TV adaptation already underway and its status as one of the most awarded and well-reviewed games of all time intact, I'm aware that this game doesn't really need a defense. What I would argue is that it's a game that demands to be revisited, because whether you played it 5 years ago and liked it all right, or you had significant criticisms, the full audio-visual interactive experience that is The Last of Us Part 2 is so dense with interesting choices, so sprawling and bold in its ambitions, and so understated in its core themes and character dynamics that it's impossible to fully appreciate with a single playthrough. Every minute of it is made of the same stuff as those final few moments of Part 1, and it is twice as long as Part 1. So here are some things I've come to love about The Last of Us Part 2 over the last 5 years. Things that I was unsure about or even flat out disliked at first, but came to admire through subsequent playthroughs. The game isn't without its missteps, but that comes with the territory when you make something this ambitious. 5 years later, this behemoth of an experience has held up and then some, because every time I return to it, I find something new to appreciate. It is better than you remember. Part 2 is not the effortless, easily digestible piece of media that the first game is. It doesn't go down nearly as smoothly, and I understand why that's a hang-up for people. At every turn, Part 2 is expecting you to be engaged, to sit up in your chair and ask, okay, why is this happening? Why is this being done in this way? And there's no better example of this dynamic than the structure of the story. When people struggle with Part 2, this is one of the main things they point out. The easy, linear flow of Part 1 is traded in for a much messier, more sprawling and literary odyssey, where timelines are crisscrossed, perspectives are swapped, and the entire game is starkly bifurcated. After a prologue section in Jackson, Wyoming, you spend 3 days in Seattle with Ellie as she hunts Abby, the woman who murdered Joel. Ellie's story reaches an unbearably tense crescendo, and the game simply stops. The 3-day clock resets, and for the next 8 hours, you play as Abby and see what she was up to for the past 3 days. There is no cutting back and forth, no gradual ramp up to ease the player into Abby's perspective. The video game itself just restarts, back to square one with a new skill tree to fill out, resources to gather, the whole thing. It's not unreasonable to call it jarring. When you think about a story told from multiple perspectives, you assume that those points of view will interweave, that will jump back and forth between characters, one level as Master Chief, one level as the Arbiter. But the thing is, these 3 days that Abby and Ellie spend in Seattle have almost nothing to do with each other. Ellie is dead set on hunting Abby down, but Abby couldn't be more oblivious to the imminent danger she's in, and their stories are presented in 2 completely separate halves. It might be easy to see this as a gimmick, like Naughty Dog sacrificed a smoother narrative just so they could unveil a big mid-game twist that people would talk about, but I don't buy that, and I'm going to argue that while this might not have been the only way this story could be told, it is the best and most interesting way. Because ultimately, Ellie and Abby are not just experiencing completely different events, but completely different video games. With Ellie, you're playing The Last of Us Part 2, a story about a person so deeply damaged and full of hatred for others and herself that she morally disintegrates. Ellie's arc is destructive, with each new step bringing her and many around her closer to annihilation. But while this tale of obsession and tragedy plays out, there's a wholly different story unfolding in Seattle, and it's The Last of Us Part 1. I'm hardly the first person to point out that Abby is Joel, a person who suffers an immense trauma that leads them down a dark path only to rediscover their humanity when tasked with protecting an innocent child. That simple redemption story that you loved in Part 1 is here. You just have to be willing to accept that Abby could be the protagonist this time. As always, the game expects you to be engaged, to consider the larger picture. Joel's actions didn't just lead to the death of Abby's father, they brought about the destruction of her entire community. And Abby didn't just lose who knows how many friends to Joel's rampage, but the ultimate goal of the Fireflies, that last hope for the world that they were working toward, was snuffed out completely. And so we follow Abby through a sort of spiritual retelling of The Last of Us Part 1, where Ellie's 3 days were a destructive descent into darkness. Abby's 3 days are genuinely redemptive as we watch her break away from the WLF and risk life and limb to protect Yara and Lev. Abby's story is the closest the game ever comes to being fully traditionally fun, with her day 2 in particular playing out as a genuine adventure with daring missions and narrow escapes, culminating in an honest-to-God boss fight straight out of something like Resident Evil. It's a catharsis that the game has earned by that point. By the end, you fully get Abby. You see her as a human being who is no more flawed or damaged than Joel was, but her redemption arc isn't as ambiguous or muddied as Joel's was. She has truly become better. And it is crucial that we, along with Ellie, are completely oblivious to all of this in the first half of the game. Part 2 is about a lot of things, but one of its core themes is perspective and the ways in which we refuse to consider the full reality of those we hate. Naughty Dog is constantly leveraging the implicit connection that the player feels with their avatar, and in the beginning, the writers are doing everything they can to align you with Ellie. In the wake of Joel's murder, you feel as wrathful as Ellie does. feels, and even if you intellectually know that her quest for vengeance probably isn't headed anywhere good, you're in sync with her emotionally. But as Ellie loses more and more of herself and pushes her loved ones away, you grow increasingly alienated from her motivations. And this is exactly where the game wants you when the perspective shift happens. At the split, you're alienated from both Ellie and Abby, which feels weird on your first playthrough because you're stranded in this emotional no man's land. Like, Ellie's clearly messed up, she's not doing great, but fuck this lady, she killed Joel. But of course, as you observe Abby's full story and see how she grows, you become more and more aligned with her. Cutting back and forth completely disrupts all of this. Or at least, that was the next line in this script, until Naughty Dog released a brand new chronological mode for Part 2, one literal day after I had fully completed this video. It was an insane coincidence that I'm actually pretty thankful for in the end, because I got the opportunity to actually test the validity of my argument. And rewrite and re-edit a huge chunk of the video, but who would be bitter about that? Definitely not me. As someone who has pretty strong feelings about the intentionality and thematic depth that the original structure provides, I was actually excited to play chronological mode. I see it purely as a fun experiment for fans to explore, and Naughty Dog makes it pretty clear that the mode is not the intended experience for first-time players. I love that they released this, and I don't see it as any sort of retconning of or apology for the original structure. First, I think it's worth pointing out all the things that surprised me in a positive way. Turning Abby's flashback to Salt Lake into the cold open to this sort of alternate universe version of the story is interesting and effective. Of course, knowing Abby's motivations from the start really undermines so much of what the game is trying to do thematically. Definitely not putting a certain television program on blast with that comment. And this section would probably be designed a little differently if it were the true opening of the game. But as an isolated example of how to introduce a sequel to The Last of Us, it's pretty effective in its own way. Chronological mode also uncovers some new transitions and juxtapositions that I enjoyed on their own merits. Watching the title screen pop up after Ellie plucks that low G on the guitar, only to jump straight to Ellie actually playing Future Days on that guitar, is just a really nice way to capture the passage of time between those two scenes. Going straight from Abby rejecting Owen because all she can think about is Joel, to Ellie walking with Tommy, lost in thought about Joel, is a really cool connection. And right at the end of day 2, Abby brings the supplies back to the aquarium, completing the first major step of her redemption arc, and we cut straight from her face of relief and satisfaction to Ellie outside the theater, her hand trembling and wet with Nora's blood. It's pretty effective as a way to tie these two stories together. And this shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but yes, it is striking how smoothly the Seattle portion of the game flows when you're cutting back and forth. And I was happy to see that they got fairly granular with the timeline, even going so far as to cut away from Abby in the middle of a cutscene in day 1. We hang with Ellie until she gets knocked out by the WLF, and then we catch up with Abby right where we left off in that cutscene. It's pretty neat, and it's true that the game feels much more propulsive and traditionally satisfying when you cut back and forth between our two protagonists. But here's where I have to reiterate that the original game is not trying to be as seamless or traditional or satisfying as possible. And it's not trying to tie Abby and Ellie together in such an explicit way. It's a story that is at least in part about how hard it is to empathize with people you think you have every reason to hate. And it wants you to feel that friction. Abby doesn't remain a mystery to the player for 10 whole hours just because the writers wanted to surprise you with a twist. She remains a mystery because the game wants you trapped in Ellie's head. It wants you to look at that aquarium like a fortress that needs to be stormed.
I think Abby picked the aquarium on purpose, so it's so damn hard to get to.
When, in reality, Abby's connection to that place is much more emotional than it is tactical. The game wants you to look at all these bloody bandages and imagine what horrors transpired here, unaware that this is where a kid's life was saved. The game wants you to observe everything about the WLF and Seraphites from afar, because this world is full of so much history and context that Ellie and her friends will never understand.
They have the whole coast covered. They're gonna shoot us out of the goddamn water.
Hey, that fake.
You sound like them.
Her sister, though. I was shocked.
Their poor mother.
Chronological mode uncovers a lot of cool moments by making all the connections between Ellie and Abby more explicit, but I think the original structure is doing something even better. It's committing to the perspectives of these characters by denying you those explicit connections. It leaves you room to weave this narrative together in your own mind. And best of all, this structure sets up one of my absolute favorite moments in the entire game. The moment where you finally confront Ellie as Abby. By this point, you've been with Abby for so long and have been so wrapped up in her story that, like her, you sort of forget about Ellie. So when Ellie pops her head up over this counter, not only is this the first time Abby is even aware of Ellie's existence in Seattle, but this is the first time the player has seen Ellie's face in something like 7 or 8 hours. An entire video game has gone by where you had no real reason to think about Ellie, and suddenly here she is. It's a moment that always makes me smile and admire how hard they committed to this wild idea. It is such a brilliant instance of emotional dissonance to be reunited with a beloved character who now feels so distant from you. When Abby is attacked by Jesse and Dina, these people are strangers from a different world. She's never met them before. They're no different than the numerous NPCs that Abby has been dispatching for the last few days. And I don't think I need to spell out how all of this is simply perfect for the kind of story that Part 2 is telling. Sure, there are a lot of cool little connections that chronological mode makes really clear, but it's even better that the game trusts you to connect those dots for yourself. And there are some other ways in which the chronological mode really suffers, like how aside from the Finding Strings flashback, you spend the first 2 hours of the game without engaging in much of anything resembling core gameplay. You also lose the sense that Joel is looming over Ellie's time in Seattle. And with that, there's very little mystery surrounding the complexity of Ellie's emotions, and I'll explain in a bit why I think that's one of the most vital components of the whole experience. Finally, I think the ending of the game really suffers, because the dance and the porch scene are now just distant memories instead of these rushes of emotion that flood in as the story comes to a close. When you've played through 20 hours of this game, it is just so deeply sad to go back in time and see these characters so much happier and healthier. How before all of this happened, they were just living their lives, navigating challenges, but also having fun, falling in love, making amends. You're reminded of how young these people are. But when you place these scenes toward the beginning of the story, that deep current of emotion is lost. Chronological mode is fun. I like that they added it. But I think this change alone makes it a far inferior way to experience this story. If you're telling a story about people locked into their own points of view, what better way to show, not tell, than to actually lock the player into those perspectives, creating numerous opportunities for dramatic and emotional tension where otherwise things would risk being too literal and explicit. No doubt this is all a really big swing, and I get why it felt a little puzzling or frustrating to some people their first time through. I know I felt a little bit of that when I first played it 5 years ago. But if that's you, I would strongly recommend giving the game another shot, because it's not put together like this by accident. The game wants to rattle you a bit. It wants to withhold information and throw a big enough wrench in the experience that you're forced to question it. And I just think there are a lot of really good answers to those questions. The Last of Us Part 2 is a revenge story in the most literal sense that the plot features a lot of revenge, but I don't think that either of our main characters are actually driven primarily by vengeance, at least when we meet up with them in the main body of the story. By the time we start to see Abby's perspective properly play out, she's already enacted her retribution, and she was left hollow by it.
I just remember shooting it and being like, this moment you've worked towards for so long and wanting it to feel right and wanting it to feel good. And it happens and you just feel fucking empty.
She's still haunted by her father's death, and most of her closest friends have grown distant from her after seeing how brutally she killed Joel. We'll circle back to this idea because I think there's a lot to it, but in some ways, Abby is a future version of Ellie. She's already had her revenge and has seen how it did nothing but strain her relationships and isolate her even further. And the question is, what's next? How will she put her life back together? That is what Abby's story is about. But Ellie is the actual core of the overarching story, and her journey and the reasons for it are much more complicated. I previously said that the ending of Part 1 invites an excavation of Joel's psychology, and Part 2 carries this dynamic forward and expands on it, turning the question of what exactly is driving Ellie into a sort of mystery for the player and even Ellie herself to untangle. We see in the opening cinematic that there's some unease between Ellie and Joel in the wake of his lie. Joel visits Ellie as she's still acclimating to life in Jackson, and she's clearly uncomfortable and doesn't really know what to make of him. She saw right through his lie about what happened at the hospital, but doesn't know how to process it, doesn't know what to do with it yet. By the end of the scene, Joel has won her over again, and we get the feeling that she's going to try to open back up and make things work with him. Now that they're living peacefully in Jackson, maybe she can choose to forget about the whole Fireflies thing. It's easier, it's safer. But over the course of 3 separate flashbacks interspersed through Ellie's journey in Seattle, we get a more complete picture of how her relationship with Joel devolved in the intervening years between games. Ellie tries to make it work for a while. She goes on a birthday camping trip with Joel to a museum where they have a genuinely wonderful time together. But the cracks in their relationship start to surface as she's reminded of the Fireflies. A couple years later, we catch up with Ellie as she's becoming consumed with thoughts about the hospital. She's grown distant from Joel, noticeably enough that Tommy all but forces the two of them to go on patrol together, hoping they'll bond again. But Ellie can't push her feelings down anymore and confronts Joel, now for the second time, about his lie. And it's here that we see a pretty ugly side of Joel. He basically gaslights her and berates her for bringing it up again.
There was no cure. I know you wish things were different. I wish things were different. But they ain't. And we need to get these kids back to their families. Is there something else you'd like to rehash?
Finally, we see Ellie travel to the old Firefly hospital to find out the truth for herself. Joel catches up with her and she gives him an ultimatum. If he lies again, this will be the last time he will ever see her. Joel finally confesses and Ellie tells him they're done. She'll go back to Jackson, but she wants nothing to do with him anymore. But in the present day, she seems to genuinely love and miss Joel.
What are you doing tonight?
I was thinking of inviting Joel to watch a movie.
Oh. You guys good?
Yeah. Joel, you'd love watching a movie in this place. The more, the merrier. Hey, look, Joel. It's your favorite.
This is a key point of tension that builds throughout Ellie's portion of the game. Towards the beginning, we don't question her motives very much. Joel was tortured and murdered, and we, the player, probably still have some level of affection for him. So when Ellie wants revenge, we go along with it. We know Ellie's relationship with him was probably complicated, but he was still a pivotal figure in her life that she surely still had some love for. But as the flashbacks progress, we learn that their relationship was not just complicated, but that it had fully imploded. Ellie did find out the truth, and she was just as furious as we thought she might be. And I think here it's important to highlight just how devastating Joel's actions at the end of Part 1 really were for Ellie. The giraffe scene kind of says it all, and hits even harder in the wake of Part 2.
We don't have to do this.
What's the other option?
Go back to Tommy's. Just be done with this whole damn thing.
It can't be for nothing.
It can't be for nothing. But then suddenly it was. Yes, the Fireflies disregarded Ellie's consent and autonomy, but so did Joel. And there's a reason why he did everything he could to keep the truth from Ellie. He understood that, if given the choice, she absolutely would go through with the surgery.
It's what she'd want. And you know it.
One of the biggest reveals at the end of Part 1 is that Ellie's need to make her immunity count was already wrapped up in a profound survivor's guilt.
Back when I was bitten, I wasn't alone. My best friend was there. And she got bit too. She says, let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together. Her name was Riley, and she was the first to die. And then it was Tess. And then Sam. I'm still waiting for my turn.
Can you imagine being the savior of the world only to be robbed of the opportunity to actually save it by the one person you've come to trust and respect? What would that do to a person?
I was supposed to die in that hospital. My life would have fucking mattered. But you took that from me.
So before Joel even dies, Ellie is living under an immense weight of helplessness and guilt. Her sense of identity and purpose was so wrapped up in creating a cure that when that door was shut without her consent, it broke something in her. So when Ellie decides to go after Abby, in a way this sort of activates her, like she has a reason for living again. She has a purpose. Maybe this can be the thing she finally finishes. Maybe this is something nobody can take from her. Maybe if she can see this one thing through, she can find some peace. We know that won't happen, and on some level deep down, Ellie probably does too, but it's all she has at this point. So Ellie embarks on her journey, and over the course of 3 days, she loses more and more of herself, committing heinous acts that will scar her for the rest of her life, growing more and more isolated as she pushes her loved ones away, and it all culminates in the death of Jesse, the father of Dina's child, and the maiming of Tommy. Once more, Abby stands over a bloodied and defenseless Ellie, and once more, Abby chooses to spare her, even if it's not strictly the most strategic choice. We jump ahead by at least a year, and here we enter the next layer of Ellie's guilt. Ellie and Dina have a home life of their own that seems cozy and idyllic enough, but just under the surface, there is serious pain and dysfunction. Ellie's PTSD is so bad that it puts her and Dina's son JJ in danger, and we see through her journal entries in the next scene that Ellie is hanging on by a thread. She's still completely stuck in her trauma, unable to make progress in her mental health. There's a letter on the table from Jesse's parents, and as kind and thoughtful as it is, it's a biting reminder of the cost of Ellie's actions in Seattle. Then Tommy arrives, his mangled body and curdled spirit, yet another reminder of Ellie's failures. It's all just too much, to a point that Ellie is looking for a way out. And Tommy, completely oblivious to the turmoil within Ellie, gives it to her.
He said they're living along this coast in a beach sailboat right here.
Ellie refuses at first, but within a minute of staring at that map, she's already gone.
I guess the thing that we don't talk about is I think she's suicidal.
Yeah, I think
agree. There's the guilt of what should have happened at the hospital.
That's why she leaves in the middle of the night. She's not saying goodbye because it's clearly suicide.
Yeah. When the pain gets too loud, she's not there anymore. She's incredibly vulnerable, but she's completely disassociated, and there is this absolute rejection of everything that is right.
This is a point where I think the game really loses some people, because it feels ridiculous if you're looking at it purely through the lens of vengeance. At this point, killing Abby is merely the justification for something much deeper. Ellie is being suffocated under the weight of her guilt and depression. She's at least partially responsible for the death of JJ's father and Tommy's current condition, and she is riddled with crippling PTSD that is seriously compromising her ability to be a good parent and a loving partner. I think she feels completely unworthy of any happiness or healing that could be on the other side of a lot of hard work that she simply has no energy for. So she takes the opportunity to remove herself from the equation and fixates on Abby again. On a narrative level, Abby is a symbol of Ellie's pain and self-destruction. So when Ellie doubles and triples down on her quest for vengeance at the expense of everyone she loves, there's nothing rational about it. This isn't really a matter of justice anymore. It's a haunted soul crawling around in the dark, clinging on to the one thing they can find any meaning in. And so, after a long journey of obsession and misery, we finally arrive at Ellie closing in on her prey at the end of the world. We'll get into some additional thoughts I have about the whole Santa Barbara chapter later on, but for now we'll focus on what's going on with Ellie in these final moments with Abby. I love this little misdirect where a corpse with a braid just like Abby Ellie's is placed directly in front of you, enhancing the reveal that Abby now looks nothing like herself. The symbol that is Abby, the muscles, the braid, it's all gone. It's such a disarming moment, and this clash between how Abby has been built up in Ellie's mind and what Ellie actually sees in front of her is enough to stop her in her tracks. She cuts Abby down and follows her in love to a pair of boats. For a moment, it looks like they might just go their separate ways, but Ellie's PTSD spikes and she still just can't let it go. I could see this scene being a bit too much for some people, but every time I play the game, I can't deny the excruciating power of it. I think the game needs this last ragged howl into the void, this rock bottom moment of animalistic hostility. It is nearly unbearable to watch these two characters I care for so deeply destroy each other so savagely, and I well up every time Ellie starts holding Abby under the water. Mere seconds away from achieving the goal she's been possessed by for nearly 2 years, Ellie teeters on the precipice of utter spiritual ruin. Even though she's fallen so far and has killed so many people, we know that this murder will truly be the end of her, because Abby is now a symbol of what Ellie could be. Remember, Abby is no stranger to the abyss of guilt and self-destruction. She spent years obsessing over Joel and transforming herself into a weapon when she could have been spending that time with the man she loves. Her revenge against Joel did nothing to quiet her demons and only left her more isolated as most of her friends recoiled from her in the aftermath. And the fallout of that revenge leads directly to the death of every last one of those friends. Not to mention that she slept with Owen despite him expecting a baby with Mel, and the major part she's played in a brutal war that has led to nothing but more violence. She has made mistake after mistake, but when given the chance to push past her guilt, she takes it. She opens up and reaches out and actively decides to grow. Abby is proof that you can truly lose yourself for a time and still make it out of the fog, that you can start over, that you can be better, and choose to live for something more than yourself. Abby is Ellie's future, if Ellie will just let herself remember what it feels like to have a future. So when Ellie finally spares Abby, I don't think it has much to do with Ellie forgiving Abby. Ellie still barely knows anything about this woman. When she stops holding Abby under the water, I think it's less of a rational decision than it is a reflexive response. Ellie gets just the briefest glimpse of a moment where she was on the cusp of real healing. It's a fleeting heartbeat of an image, a snippet of a memory that has been long buried under the rubble of her trauma and pain, but it's just enough to push her into her first real step away from the abyss. She lets Abby go, and in that split second, Ellie has a future again, even if she has lost almost everything. Ellie returns to the farm, and Dina and JJ are gone. Ellie picks up the guitar that has served as a symbol of her connection to Joel throughout the game, but she can't play it anymore because she lost 2 of her fingers in the fight with Abby. She also lost the knife that her mother left her in that fight. The only tangible connections that she still has to her mother and father are now gone.
How is it that you're never scared?
Who says that I'm not?
What are you scared of?
Being by myself. I'm scared of ending up alone.
And it's here where the mystery of Ellie's internal life finally and fully comes into focus. And not just for the player. She remembers visiting Joel the night before he was murdered. That night, she expressed a desire to forgive him for what he did at the hospital.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
In her last true interaction with Joel, she took a step toward reconciliation and healing. And to be fair to Ellie, this chance at peace was indeed ripped away by Abby. It's just one more thing that Ellie never got to finish on her own terms. And now we've finally uncovered the most crucial layer of the guilt that drives Ellie. What if she had visited him on that porch sooner? How many movie nights could they have enjoyed together? That museum flashback is not just a happy memory for Ellie, it's a reminder that Joel really did love her. It was a complicated love that had a dark side, but all the same, he truly cared for her. He found a tape of a rocket launch to create a fleeting moment of escape for her. He was reading books about space to try to understand her better, despite being comically oblivious to her sexuality.
I hear the way Jesse talks about you.
No, Jesse and I are just friends.
No, I've got a pretty keen eye for these sort of things.
Not so keen with this one.
He's immediately supportive and protective when he learns about that side of her.
I have no idea what that girl's intentions are, but I do know that she would be lucky to have you.
He's a good dad in his way, and Ellie is devastated by the fact that she spent those years in resentment toward him, even if that resentment was completely valid. I think Naughty Dog keeps this key bit of context obscured right up until the very end to sort of simulate Ellie's state of mind for most of the game. In the wake of Joel's murder, she is neither able nor willing to remember what it felt like to just let go. She regresses to a state of desperation for purpose, and killing Abby becomes that purpose for her. As the player, by the time you get to Santa Barbara, Ellie's motivations feel so abstract and foggy, and I think this is putting you in Ellie's head. Her machine-like determination to see this vengeance through is as ill-defined and irrational to her as it is to you. She's forgotten that safety and community are there for her if she can just let herself embrace them. So that final scene on the porch becomes a sort of skeleton key for Ellie's psychology. It clarifies so much of what we saw Ellie do throughout the game, and it's what Ellie finally remembers about herself that leads her back towards some semblance of peace. Very little of this was clear or obvious to me on my first playthrough. I just know that porch scene devastated me, and I can only surmise that my emotional connection to the game was way ahead of my intellectual connection to it. As usual, Naughty Dog is letting you connect the dots. They're letting you ask the questions. At no point does the game spell out that Ellie is driven by guilt more than pure vengeance. And if you perceive Ellie as being driven only by vengeance, I can see how the game could feel onerous and repetitive, how the disconnect between you and Ellie just gets too wide. But there is so much more going on with her, and it's rooted in the sheer complexity of her relationship with Joel. She was so deeply wronged by him, and so deeply loved by him, and there's no clean way to harmonize that reality. It's just messy. So ultimately, I think it's safe to say that this game has a lot more on its mind than violence and revenge are bad. This specific game is about people walking right up to the edge of utter spiritual ruin and finding a reason to back up. It's about how we tend to bear our burdens alone, isolating ourselves and turning inward when we should be reaching out. It's about the deep pull that self-destruction and self-sabotage can have on us when we find ourselves emotionally compromised. Will you let your pain and guilt eat you alive, or will you focus that energy in a positive direction? It is also about cycles of violence, absolutely, but for the most part, this isn't the level that I connect with the game on. The cycle of violence is simply the most straightforward, surface-level idea in a game that is packed with ideas. Not to mention that it's the easiest one to condense into a marketing soundbite.
I became really intrigued with the idea of the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence, the cycle of violence.
I've never felt a pull toward vengeance in my life, but I've sure felt the pull towards self-sabotage and isolation. I've grappled with floods of guilt and regret. And not to get too specific, but let's just say that not knowing how to move forward with an estranged father figure is not a totally alien feeling to me. Zooming out a ways, I think The Last of Us as a series has two central themes that are pretty easy to argue for. The most basic one centers on how we conceive of our in-groups and out-groups. Ellie has a very broad idea of the community she belongs to. She cares deeply about the world and humanity as a whole, to the point that she would be willing to die in order to save it. Joel has a very narrow conception of his community. He basically only cares about those closest to him, to the point that he would doom the entire world if it meant a loved one wouldn't come to harm. And of course, Part 2 plays with this theme constantly, emphasizing all the ways in which these various factions are primarily looking out for themselves and their own, not considering the stories that the other factions might have to tell. This preoccupation with in-groups and out-groups is a constant fixture of both games. But there's a second main theme that I think is a bit more interesting, and it's the idea that love is humanity's defining trait, for good and ill.
It makes it so much more sad because it's like, just stick with Dina. Look how you have love and care.
It's so interesting because it's what The Last of Us is about. It's like within this room right now, you have like two kinds of love. There's this very positive one with Dina and this kind of negative one of like, I gotta get the people that hurt the person I love.
In Part 1, Joel effectively dooms humanity out of love for Ellie. It's a selfish kind of love that all but disregards Ellie's own agency and has dire consequences for her emotional well-being. But there is a lot of genuine love wrapped up in all of it as well. The world isn't worth saving without her in it.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
At the very least, it's a decision that is partially rooted in Joel's love for his lost daughter, Sarah, and the trauma he carries from her death. Likewise, Abby is driven by her love for her father and her community who were destroyed by Joel. And Ellie, at least in part, is driven by her love for Joel and the pain she feels at having the chance to fully express that love taken from her. This series is about the ways in which human beings are sort of cursed by our capacity to love. We are these weird creatures that can't help but bind ourselves to each other in these deeply meaningful, intimate connections. We're compelled to care about things on such a spiritual level that our loyalty to the things and people we care for becomes fierce. And to be clear, that's a beautiful thing. The Last of Us is a pretty dark series, but it's not without a considerable measure of warmth, friendship, romance, humor, vulnerability, and selflessness. Some people read The Last of Us as a purely cynical, nihilistic series that thinks the worst of human beings, and I just don't see that. These games are intensely interested in people and clearly have a deep affection for their characters. The existence of Jackson itself is a pretty striking portrayal of the best of humanity. That said, the fierce loyalty that is inseparable from the beautiful kind of love that human beings experience absolutely has a dark side. As long as we have the capacity to love deeply, we have the capacity to hate deeply. These games take that idea to some pretty bleak places, but I think it's always an honest assessment, and a much more interesting one than violence is bad. We know that, and the game knows that we know that. That reality is just a given in this story. So if you played The Last of Us Part 2 and came away wondering why a video game needed to spend 25 hours telling you that violence and revenge are bad, I'd encourage you to give the game another look, because the real meat of this story is laying underneath those surface level themes. As a stealth action experience, Part 2 is pretty goddamn incredible. It might not boast a level of improvisational freedom that you see in a Metal Gear title, but on the whole, the stealth and combat sandbox of Part 2 is seriously accomplished. The density and verticality of the environments and the fluidity with which you can move through them, the quality of the AI, the unbelievable fidelity of the animation system, it's all world-class video game shit. But is that a problem? Is it a problem that the game with the really well done violence is emphasizing how brutal and awful that violence actually is? As is usually the case with Part 2, the game leaves you to answer that question for yourself. It leaves you to make the connections. The violence is an integral part of the texture of the world in this series. No matter how morally defensible, the killing is always brutal and ugly. Even when you play as Abby, where nearly all of her human kills are made in an effort to protect Lev and or Yara, and are therefore at least marginally justified, it's not traditionally fun, lighthearted times. It still has a cost and a weight to it. And just to reinforce the Abby is Joel angle, the same goes for the violence in Part 1, which is essentially just as savage as most anything you can find in Part 2, but feels at least somewhat acceptable because Joel kills in order to keep Ellie safe. With Ellie, you are role-playing as a character who is compelled to walk a path they rationally know to be destructive. That's why the interactivity of the experience is so key. You inhabit Ellie whether you want to or not, and like her, you seemingly have no choice but to press on. At any point, Ellie could stop, turn around, and head home. But she won't, she can't, at least not within the emotional and mental state she finds herself in. And the game is marrying you to her compulsion by giving you no choice but to act along with her.
Philosophically, with this game, what we wanted to do was allow our characters to make immoral choices that the audience would not be on board with. You're now like playing this thing that you are not on board with at all. You have to keep going, and in a way that does align you with Ellie.
Part 2 is inviting you to safely roleplay some complicated and dark emotions. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that there's something alluring about violence in the human psyche, especially when that violence has a sense of justice to it. Here's a totally unrelated video game character to drive that point home. As we've pointed out a few times now, this game is constantly leveraging your psychological and emotional connection to the player character. And I think for a lot of Ellie's sections, you're free to feel a bit of that intoxication, a bit of that rush that comes with sticking it to those bastards. And the game isn't calling you a bad person for experiencing that feeling. The combat in The Last of Us Part 2 is a static fixture of the experience, but your feelings about it don't have to be. There are times when it's kind of exhilarating because you're invested in the stakes and care for the characters. There are times when it's repulsive because you're at such odds with what the character on screen is doing on a moral level. And there are times when it's so utterly heartbreaking that you wish you could just turn the game off. These are all valid things to feel while interacting with a piece of art, and Part 2 is okay with you experiencing that whole spectrum. I think the violence in Part 2 is successfully threading a number of different needles in some pretty fascinating ways. It's a game that I have to be in a pretty specific mood to play, like this isn't a video game to chill and blow off steam with, but when I'm ready to experience the full range of emotions the game is offering, I think the violence is doing exactly what it needs to be doing. This isn't an RPG or a Telltale experience. It's not involving the player in the story on a decision-making level. It primarily wants you to feel something and to put your sympathy for these characters in a state of near constant tension. For a long time, the Santa Barbara epilogue was a sticking point for me. This relatively brief final chapter throws so much at you and represents such a dramatic vibe shift for the game that it's understandably a bit jarring when you don't know where it's all going. But I've now fully settled into the particularly bleak, nigh apocalyptic tone of this finale, and this epilogue has actually become one of my favorite sections of the whole experience. There's a remark in Ellie's journal about how it looks like the military never came through here because it was all just too spread out. So much of The Last of Us takes place in the aftermath of Fedra control, marked by checkpoints, quarantine zones, military vehicles, and bombed out streets and buildings. But Santa Barbara has remained relatively untouched by that kind of oversight for decades, and it seems like most people decided to leave. Despite marking such a sharp aesthetic departure from the persistent gloom of Seattle, there's something ghostly about the sun-bleached ambience of this place. Naughty Dog manages to make beautiful Santa Barbara feel sickly somehow, like it's all been left to rot in the salty sea air for 25 years. A perfect setting for the game's various tangled threads to finally converge. By this point, you're about 20 hours into the game, and you've settled into a rhythm of going on these prolonged pursuits where you start on one end of town and you have to get to some sort of structure on the other end. So when you take control of Abby in Santa Barbara and learn that the Fireflies are still around and that they're based in Catalina Island, it's natural enough to assume that you'll be making your way there. You're aware that Ellie is closing in and that Abby will probably run into her, but you're acclimated enough to the rhythm of these long traversal sections that it's just what you're expecting by that point. But out of nowhere, that long trek you think you're in for is cut brutally short. The game uses your expectations against you and flips the whole status quo of Abby and Lev's story. And now we get into the Rattlers. I had no idea what to make of these guys when I first played the game. I remember feeling like they didn't quite belong in this story, and I've heard multiple critics express some confusion about how they fit in thematically. After all, this game is constantly hammering away at the idea that everyone has a story and a reason behind their actions. It's all moral ambiguity all the time. But suddenly, we're introduced to a faction that is so flagrantly evil that it can feel like they exist purely as cannon fodder for an obligatory climactic battle. But after a few playthroughs, some things started to crystallize for me. For one, I don't think the Rattlers contradict the theme of moral ambiguity as much as they contrast it. Yes, human beings and their social groups are often endlessly complex, multi-layered, morally gray things, but sometimes there are people or institutions that are truly just irredeemable. The Rattlers are slavers. They trap and kidnap people to use as forced labor in their compound. We witness how an escaping prisoner would rather end his own life than be brought back to the Rattler plantation. This is not a resistance movement that fell back into patterns that it was once resisting, or a once peaceful religious group that was eventually taken over by a more fanatical, violent sect. This is a society that explicitly subsists on horrific levels of exploitation. Sometimes things are just terrifyingly simple like that, and I appreciate that the game highlights this reality. Of course, there are not always multiple valid sides. Sometimes there are just true villains. So Ellie comes onto the scene in Sarah Connor Terminator 2 mode and has to infiltrate the Rattler compound to get Abby. And this is where I realized something that turned this whole section into one of my favorite stretches of the game. Ellie's rampage through the Rattlers is a warped mirror image of Joel's rampage through the Fireflies in part 1. On a superficial level, both sequences are fairly similar. They're both scrappy battles through heavily guarded compounds. The player is given their first fully automatic weapon and encounters armored enemies for the first time. And the goal at the end is to find a single person that the player character is exclusively concerned with. But dig down a bit and you see that there's a pretty delicious inversion happening here. Joel's rampage through the Firefly hospital is a desperate fight to save Ellie's life. Or at least that's how Joel would explain it.
I saved her.
But looking from the outside in, Joel is essentially a mass shooter who not only guns down dozens of people, but dooms humanity itself. The internal perspective feels righteous, but the outward reality is arguably pretty monstrous. So how would an outside observer perceive Ellie's actions in Santa Barbara? Well, from this perspective, Ellie seems like a heroic liberator, storming the compound of literal slavers and freeing their captives. It's one of the few instances of relatively justifiable violence that Ellie doles out, because fuck these guys. But we know why Ellie is actually here. We know that it's nothing but turmoil inside Ellie at this point. She has shed so much of her humanity that she has become this strange reflection of the absolute darkest facets of Joel. The precocious, compassionate girl we once knew who cared so much for the world around her is completely gone, and nothing but a hardened killer is left.
It's like, had this exchange happened earlier, if she killed someone in cold blood earlier, there'd be a very different reaction. It's like she's becoming more and more like Joel at this point. More and more capable and more cold about violence, where she could just execute it and move on and not think twice about it.
Just like how the larger reality of what the Fireflies were doing at that hospital was immaterial to Joel, the plight of the people around Ellie is immaterial to her. She is only there for Abby.
Big group.
better find her before these idiots kill her.
He's got a gun! He's got a gun!
So after a prolonged battle against the Rattlers, Ellie finally makes it to the cages where the slaves are kept. And there's this weird unspoken dynamic between them, where the slaves seem to realize that this crazed, bloody woman isn't actually there to free them. There's actually a note that you find next to a dead Rattler as Ellie is approaching the compound. And it's from a woman who escaped and promises that she'll be returning with a group. Your time is coming, she threatens. So it's possible that this group in the cage has been expecting a rescue. As they pour out of the cage, Ellie is scanning each face, looking for her target. And the very first thing she says to them is, "Where's Abby?" Then they almost shoot each other out of a misunderstanding, and it's just so awkward and sad. Here's this horrendous human misery right in front of Ellie's face, and she just doesn't seem to care. What if Abby had been in that cage? What would that have even looked like? She's so far afield of any sort of rational thought at this point that there's no attempt to help the slaves any further. It's only Abby. And I just have to say, the imagery of this section is so pitch perfect. The palm trees swaying in the wind against the glow of a raging fire and the sounds of fighting in the distance. It evokes something like Apocalypse Now. It's perfect. And then we come to the final fight between Ellie and Abby, and it's a distorted and miserable reflection of the final showdowns and boss fights that we've come to expect from films and video games. It's the point where an already emotionally exhausting game wrings you completely dry as you wince at every blow and beg Ellie to stop. These two characters that you love destroying each other in a gray void at the end of the world. Ellie left with nothing but the single shred of her own humanity that she managed to hold on to. Though it puzzled me at first, Santa Barbara is now one of my favorite sections of the whole game. All of the clashing emotions of Part 2 are made manifest in this desolate, beautiful place where even a golden sunset feels apocalyptic and oppressive. The further in you get, the deeper you sink into this fever dream of blood loss and obsession. It's where the various layers of symbolism and parallel characterization fully melt into each other to form this final provocative statement. It is the ending this story deserves. But thankfully, the game still has more to say. We experience the overwhelming emotion of the flashback to Joel and Ellie on the porch. Ellie finally lays Joel to rest and walks out into the woods. The credits roll, but the final image of the story is yet to come. Up to this point, the title screen of the game has shown one of those small boats floating in the gray Santa Barbara void. Every time you start the game up, you're greeted with this simple little scene. But when you exit the end credits, you're left with a new title screen. It's Abby and Lev's boat on the shore of Catalina Island. They made it. This is the final image that The Last of Us Part 2 leaves you with. It's hope. And if Abby is that symbol of Ellie's future, then we can believe that somehow Ellie will make it out of that gray void as well. Part 2 is a much darker, more emotionally exhausting game than Part 1. And on the surface, it's easy to see the ending as mercilessly bleak. But the very end is much more emotionally generous to the player than it might first seem. There is a way out, and there is a future. I wanted to highlight a few disconnected elements or moments that I admire, but didn't feel the need to develop into full chapters in this video. First, I love Joel's final ride into the sunset at the start, and the elegant handoff it represents as you're invited to play as Joel one last time and join him in mulling over everything he just confessed to Tommy. The prologue of Part 1 is rightfully lauded as one of the all-time great video game openings, and Naughty Dog wisely resists resist the temptation to one-up themselves, instead opting for this serene, deep breath before the plunge. So much of the storytelling in Part 2 exists outside of the cutscenes and within the incidental dialogue between the player character and a companion, and the majority of the game plays out in this way. But Part 2 has several sections where either Ellie or Abby are placed in a lonely pursuit of some goal. Beyond the fact that a core theme of the game is isolation and the ways in which these characters tend to carry their burdens on their own, I like how the game seems to invite you to inhabit the character's headspace for a little while. The game gives you time to reflect on what's going on and how you feel about it. And in Ellie's case in particular, it's okay with making you feel genuinely lonely. It's a risky approach because I remember these sections feeling a bit frustrating from a pacing perspective on my first playthrough. I just wanted to get straight to the next major story development to see what happens. But on subsequent playthroughs, I've come to really enjoy the vibe of these lonely, contemplative sections. It pains me that I didn't find a way to work Owen into the main body of the script, because he's one of the characters that represents the moral core of this whole experience. His monologue about the Seraphite he refused to kill is always entrancing to me, and I love how palpable his exhaustion with the whole war is. Obviously, he has issues. Don't cheat on and leave your pregnant partner, bro. But in a world full of murderers and psychos, I think his sins aren't any less forgivable than anyone else's. Owen is such a bright spot in this story.
Look at these. I'd love to meet this kid.
I mean, he's a scar. Maybe you have.
Jesus, I sure hope not.
It can be easy to forget that Naughty Dog games are genuinely well-directed pieces of filmmaking. There are like 4.5 hours of cutscenes in this game, and all of them feature such accomplished camera direction and editing. Look at how the camera tracks with Joel as he enters Ellie's room in the opening cinematic, placing us in his shoes as he attempts to close the distance that he senses between them. As he speaks with Ellie, the camera stays on the left side of the line of action, but as he performs Future Days for Ellie and starts to win her over, we focus on her face as the camera floats across the line, indicating a shift in the relationship has occurred. The camera now rests on the right side of the line of action for the remainder of the scene. Now, in the third flashback, where Ellie and Joel's relationship fully implodes, we don't track with Joel as he approaches because we're in Ellie's perspective now. When she pushes Joel away, the camera lingers on this frame, emphasizing the distance she's put between them. Once we're back in over-the-shoulder coverage, the camera rests on the right side of the line of action, until Joel finally confesses to Ellie, which triggers an axis switch where the camera lands on the left side of the line, signaling another fundamental shift in their relationship. As Ellie storms off, the camera tracks with her, re-establishing the distance and removing us from Joel's presence. This is not groundbreaking cinema, but it is rock-solid, intentional filmmaking. The cinematography and blocking in The Last of Us is deceptively sophisticated. The choices in lenses and depth of field, the judicious use of wides and close-ups, the intentionality of the camera's movement, this stuff is always motivated and thought through in a way that I think is pretty exceptional in video games. I like how the mini open world section of Ellie's Day 1 has such a relatively light, adventurous tone to it, even if the city itself feels huge and ominous. It's a fun little stretch of exploration where Ellie and Dina are still totally oblivious to just how drastically this is all going to fall apart, and it's a section of gameplay that I always look forward to. Part of me wishes there was a section like this for Abby's half, but I don't think the narrative really allows for it. Abby's story has too many ticking clocks that demand a more urgent approach, and her story builds up to that sense of adventure instead of giving you a false sense of it to start with. I love how Dina is persistently asking Ellie if she recognizes any of the WLF they face off against in Day 1.
I don't recognize him.
You recognize any of these guys?
No.
You recognize any of them?
None.
highlighting how the violence of Ellie's journey is already spilling over and affecting people who had nothing to do with Joel's death. Something I love about Abby's portion of the story is how little the game seems to be trying to make you like her. She's prickly and self-serious in a way that makes Part 2 Ellie seem like a barrel of laughs. She shows zero outward remorse for what she did to Joel, even if we eventually see that it's been eating her up internally. And we witness her saying some pretty alarming things about the Seraphites.
Manny, they're kids. It's not their fault. Not our fault either. Those deaths are on them.
Now, of course, the game is, in fact, trying to win us over to her side. I'm fully aware that that's exactly what Naughty Dog is doing, but I appreciate how they never overplay their hand here. The WLF Stadium might be one of my favorite physical environments in all of video games. The sheer volume and density of detail crammed into this absolutely massive space is nothing short of astounding, considering how little screen time it enjoys. You can spend a solid half hour just walking around and observing how these people live their lives, how they do their laundry, make their food, educate their kids, where they live, how they farm and organize livestock. And then you hop into this truck with Manny, Mel, and Alice, and at any point you can just activate the photo mode and inspect yet another equally detailed, massive area that enjoys even less screen time as the truck careens through it. The commitment to fully realizing Abby's world here is such a highlight for me. There's a great little detail that crops up right after Abby heads toward the hospital with Lev in day 2. The game places several notes in your path that detail altercations the WLF has had with Seraphites. It's just that little nudge of a reminder of the context in which Abby is starting to work with these kids. Maybe even a suggestion that Abby should rethink everything she's putting on the line to get these supplies for Yara. Aren't these people that she's supposed to hate? Aren't these people who have been killing off her friends? It's one of those great little touches that is so fitting for the interactive medium. This little interaction between Lev and Abby always makes me smile.
Do other people think you're funny?
No.
All that said, the game isn't perfect. There are a few scenes that feature some writing that's a bit less understated than I would like, particularly Jerry's save the zebra moment. And the dead Firefly, who apparently engaged in some capital E, capital S environmental storytelling before killing himself, always struck me as a bit silly. Sometimes the game feels like it's a bit too beholden to the expectations that ostensibly come packaged with a $220 million first-party action title. For instance, I'm not sure that the old upgrade system of scarfing down pills to give yourself increased prone movement speed or whatever really needed to make the jump from part 1 to part 2. And at times I wish the game had leaned a bit harder on survival mechanics and traversal over combat. Finally, while the working conditions at Naughty Dog during the development of part 2 are well documented, I still think it's important to acknowledge the real-life cost behind this game's success. No piece of art, no matter how great, is worth overworking your employees. I appreciate that Naughty Dog addresses the problem so directly in the Grounded Part 2 documentary and have at least verbally committed themselves to improving on this front. There are a number of other little issues I could list, but ultimately they all spring from the fact that the game is just so damn huge and ambitious. When you commit this hard to delivering an experience to your audience, there are going to be some rough edges, but I'll gladly take the rough edges over something too safe and overfamiliar. I was originally hoping to have this video done by the time Season 2 of the show released, which... wow. But I'm glad that I got to watch Season 2 as I was polishing this script, because more than anything, it further emphasized all the things that I love about this game. While the show has a lot of its own strengths, I can't get away from the feeling that it trusts and respects its audience so much less than the game does. The line that everyone repeated for years was that the game felt like a prestige HBO show that you could play. So how strange it is to finally watch an actual primetime HBO adaptation of Part 2, and to quickly come to the conclusion that they kind of dumbed the game down. Characters constantly talk about who they are, why they're here, and how they feel, and thematic through lines that were left unspoken in the game are stated explicitly to the audience.
Because everything you do for you.
You think you're good and I'm bad?
It feels to me like some of the overblown backlash to Part 2 made the writers lose their nerve a bit, like they felt the need to signpost and spell things out more lest the audience turn on them, which I'm sympathetic to, but it makes for a dynamic that is so far from the oblique thorniness and understatement that I love the source material for. Because The Last of Us Part 2 is not a brave game because it kills Joel, or makes you play as his killer for 8 hours, or fundamentally transforms Ellie into a monster. It's a brave game because it fully expects you to feel multiple, evolving, contradictory things about all of those events across its entire runtime. It's brave because it's made in such a way that if you are not actively connecting the dots and holding various perspectives and bits of context and tension, there is a fairly good chance that you might reject the entire thing. Ultimately, I didn't hate the show like some fans of the game clearly do. I get that changes and compromises need to be made when adapting a story to a different medium. And again, I think the show has plenty of strengths and even makes a few genuinely inspired additions to the story. But overall, the show mostly made me want to tell everyone to just play the game. It's simply richer, more layered, and less hand-holding. It's a far more interesting, affecting experience. To reiterate a point I made toward the beginning of the video, I'm aware that this game doesn't really need a defense. It has already enjoyed mountains of praise and accolades, and I hope this hasn't come off too much like a reaction against criticisms of Part 2. I'm much more interested in sharing all the things that I grew to love about the game as I replayed it over the years. Things that I emotionally resonated with, but had to develop into thoughts that I could actually articulate. Something really unlocked for me when I realized that Part 2 is basically the final 10 minutes of Part 1 turned into a full video game. It's all of the contradictory emotions and murky character psychology of that finale amplified and expanded in ways that I just find exhilarating and moving. 5 years out, I think Part 2 holds up and then some. And like most great art, it continues to unfold a little more every time I revisit it. So if it's been a while since you played it, give it another shot. Even if you liked it, there's a good chance that you'll get more out of it than you did the first time. It is even better than you remember.